Hi everyone, welcome back to Info 3370, studying social inequality with data science. Today we're talking about Nozick and the entitlement theory of justice that he puts forth in his book Anarchy, State, and Utopia. And I'd like to start by asking the question, why Nozick at all? As you will come to learn over the course of this class, Nozick represents a libertarian philosophical position that the government should not be involved in redistributing incomes. If you know anything about me, you know that this is not my personal position. But I think Nozick's argument still has some compelling components to it. And I also think, to quote Nozick himself, intellectual honesty demands that, occasionally at least, we go out of our way to confront strong arguments opposed to our views. How else are we to protect ourselves from continuing in error? I think this is actually a pretty good argument, that when there's someone with a strong argument who's diametrically opposed to you, something important to do is to engage with that argument and see if you can find any common ground by looking at how they see the world. Nozick's most famous example is this example about Wilt Chamberlain, who was a very famous basketball player at the time Nozick wrote the book. And he puts forth this hypothetical that Wilt Chamberlain is greatly in demand by basketball teams. And he supposes that they create a procedure where Chamberlain agrees to play only if 25 cents of each ticket for admission goes to him. And you see how if he makes this agreement, then people, they cheerfully attend his team's games, and each time they drop a separate 25 cents into a special box with Chamberlain's name on it. You can see where this is going. At the end of the day, Chamberlain winds up with $250,000, larger than anyone else on the team. Nozick uses this example because it's pretty powerful. When you read the example, there's not a lot about it that seems like a form of injustice. People had a bunch of money, they voluntarily gave it to Chamberlain, they got to see him play, and he got to walk home with way more money than everyone else. And this is a powerful example because it asks us to think about whether the government would have any role in redistributing Chamberlain's income to help correct for this amount of inequality. So we're going to get there in a little bit, but I want to first start with the big question that motivates Nozick's work. Should there be a state at all? This is the question at the core of basically all political philosophy, because what these political philosophers are doing is trying to argue about whether any state should exist, and if it should exist, how extensive ought that state to be. For Nozick, he makes two claims. First, a minimal state is justified. Second, a more extensive state is not. So at least according to Nozick, we should have a state that provides a policing function and protects us from harms by others, but a state that should not do anything else. Most of all, should not redistribute people's incomes. So let's start with his first claim. A minimal state is justified. Suppose that there were no state. How would you protect yourself? Nozick proposes that people might voluntarily join protective associations, where you would subscribe to some private company and that company would agree to protect you from harms by others. Then he says, well, what if the associations with the different clients conflict? This seems almost unavoidable. A client from Association A has a claim against Association B, and Associations A and B have different rules about what you're owed when someone wrongs you, or what it even means to be wronged by someone else. So he argues that in that scenario, the most powerful of the associations would win, and it would actually monopolize power. That association, in order to protect its own clients, would forbid the other associations from operating within its borders. Because after all, those associations represent a threat to the clients of the powerful association. So we've now, by sort of just natural processes, come to a place where there's one organization that monopolizes the use of force within a territory. And that's a key component for Nozick's vision of what a state is. So then he asks, can the monopoly leave the non-subscribers unprotected? After all, there's a bunch of people within its borders who wanted to subscribe to a different protective association, but now their protective association is rendered useless because the monopoly has told it cannot operate. So those people are unprotected, and they're unprotected because the monopoly caused this. And Nozick argues that monopoly must compensate those people for its actions that prevent their protective associations from working. So he says the monopoly has a moral obligation to protect everyone in this case. So on the first points, the move toward a monopoly was just through natural processes. On this last point, Nozick argues that there's a moral claim that monopoly must then protect even the people who don't subscribe to the monopoly. So at this point, we have a minimal state. We have one that monopolizes force and one that protects everyone. And it's important for Nozick that he's built out this minimal state, because this is what's going to allow him to draw a sharp line where he's going to say that this amount of state is justified and any more state is unjustified. So before he does that, he has a quick concern. Is the minimal state redistributive? After all, he's going to argue against redistribution. But in the minimal state, some people pay to this protective association that monopolizes power, and others, perhaps others within the association or others who would have chosen a different association, they call for protection, and the association comes and protects them. So we have some amount of socialization going on here. And Nozick says no, this is not redistributive, because for him the term redistributive applies to the types of reasons for an arrangement, rather than to the arrangement itself. So sure, it's the case that these associations are redistributing, where people pay in and only some of them actually call for protection, but the goal is not redistribution. The goal is just to protect everyone from harm. So if we agree with Nozick, we've now come to a place where a minimal state is justified. This lets us move on to his second point, which is the more controversial point, that any state more extensive than the minimal state is not justified. So for this, I want to return to the Wilt Chamberlain example. Recall that people voluntarily pay Chamberlain, and he gets a lot of money. And Nozick wants us to consider, could any morally justified law redistribute Chamberlain's income? Does the government have any right to take what Chamberlain earned through these transfers from people made voluntarily, and then take that money and redistribute it across other people for some broader social ends? Nozick argues that this is not justified. In particular, he suggests that any such law requires, quote, continuous interference with people's lives. And he argues that that kind of interference is morally unjustified. He says that we all have a right to our holdings as long as those holdings are acquired justly. So people voluntarily put money into Chamberlain's bucket, Chamberlain got lots of money, and there's nothing the state should do to correct for that. At the core of Nozick's argument is a sense of the entitlement theory of justice, and that's his term for his theory. He says, quote, whatever arises from a just situation by just steps is itself just. So two key components of his argument are, one, the original acquisition of holdings. So there are a bunch of things in the world and they are unheld, and somehow people come to hold those. And in this step, Nozick draws on past arguments from Locke about how people mix their labor with things and then come to possess those things. Once people come to possess things, then they transfer those things among each other. So this is like paying the 25 cents in order to see Chamberlain play. And Nozick argues that as long as those transfers are just, then the result from whatever happens out of the acquiring of holdings and the transfer of holdings is itself a just distribution. So given this argument, I'd like to consider Nozick and Rawls alongside one another. At their core, Nozick says if people acquire things justly, then whatever distribution results is just. Rawls, by contrast, says that a just distribution is the one that we would choose in the original position. And when you put these next to each other, you can see a key difference between the two arguments. So let's consider what is fundamentally different in the logic of these arguments. A fundamental difference is that Nozick appeals to historical principles. He says that what makes a distribution just is the historical process by which that distribution arose. It's a process involving just acquisitions and just transfers. Rawls, by contrast, uses what Nozick terms end-state principles. For Rawls, it doesn't really matter the historical process by which the just distribution arises. Rather, what matters is that distribution, that end result, is the one that we would choose if placed in the original position. So these are wildly different perspectives about what makes a distribution just. And you might think that they are just diametrically opposed. After all, Nozick wrote his book in response to Rawls's book. But I think it's worth considering, could these two perspectives ever lead to the same conclusion about redistribution? In particular, can you imagine any scenario where Nozick would say, the government really does need to redistribute income in this particular case? So one example that Nozick deals with explicitly in the book is the example of past injustice. He says, quote, "Not all actual situations are generated in accordance with the two principles of justice in holdings. Some people steal from others or defraud them or enslave them. If past injustice has shaped present holdings, what ought to be done to rectify these injustices?" So Nozick recognizes that people in the world don't hold their possessions justly, necessarily, and he recognizes that if we can trace through history and see how those possessions came to be held unjustly, then perhaps the government ought to step in to rectify those injustices and get us back to a place where we can continue down the just process in the future. And to put it most bluntly, he says, quote, "Past injustices might be so great as to make necessary in the short run a more extensive state in order to rectify them." And I think this is powerful because it gives those of us who'd like to argue for more redistribution a clear argument from the principles of libertarian philosophy that people ought to have a right to their holdings if those holdings are acquired justly. If we can show that those holdings were acquired unjustly, then we can argue for someone who believes in the importance of individual property rights that we ought to intervene to correct for those past forms of injustice. Now, this kind of argument is very different than an argument you'd make from a Rawlsian perspective, but I think it's useful to be able to engage with both kinds of argument when thinking about what sort of society we'd like to have. So I'm going to close with our learning goals for today. By the end of class, I hope you are now able to justify a minimal state following Nozick's argument and critique any more extensive state on the grounds of individual rights. People have a right to their holdings, they have a right to transfer those holdings however they'd like, and thus the government has no place, according to Nozick, in redistributing those incomes. Next, I hope you can now draw contrasts between historical principles of justice, like Nozick, and end-state principles of justice as put forth by Rawls. And finally, I hope you understand these arguments enough that you can now recognize how these different logics could actually, at least hypothetically, both lead to redistribution today, with the clear example of correcting past injustice. And this launches us nicely into the next segment of the class, where we're going to talk about wealth inequality in America. And we're going to ask the question of whether the distribution of holdings that actually exists today can be understood as the result of just acquisitions and just transfers, or whether we need to correct for past injustices and intervene to produce a more equal distribution. So we'll stop there for today.